Today, I want to dive into overtraining versus overreaching, what they are, and how they impact your training as a hybrid athlete. So, first of all, just quickly set the table of what we're talking about here. With both of these concepts, we're generally looking at pushing too far with your training to the point where you're seeing some kind of a performance dip. Now, one of the biggest distinctions between the two of them is the time scale. So, number one, if we're looking at overreaching, you're probably looking at, a week or two, or maybe even a little less than a week of your performance dipping. Maybe sometimes a little more, a few weeks at a time. Whereas overtraining is a much longer time scale where we're looking at months of a consistent performance drop. And the same sort of thing applies to recovering from both of these things. So, overreaching is going to be pretty quick to recover from. You're talking about days, maybe a few weeks, whereas overtraining can take many months to recover from. So, let's first break down a little further what overreaching is, if it's a good thing, a bad thing, and maybe even how you can use it in your training as well. So let me first start off by saying that overreaching can absolutely be intentional. So this is something that's typically going to happen as you're increasing your training load and or your training intensity. So if this is intentional, what it can look like is, over a period of a few weeks or so, you're slowly increasing, right up until you find the point where you just can't fully recover from your training sessions again, at which point you allow your body to fully recover. And the idea is that it adapts and it comes back stronger, faster, and fitter. With that said, it's also possible to overreach in an unintentional way, which is obviously not as ideal. And this can, again, happen in many ways. It could be that your training, again, in the same way, is, increasing or is just at an intensity and load that you can't handle, but just not intentional. And that causes you to start overreaching. Or, there's other ways you can get here, various lifestyle factors. For example, if you're going through a higher stress period, or you're not sleeping as well, your diet's not as good, these are all factors that can affect the way you recover and ultimately lead to overreaching. Or it can be a combination of both training factors and lifestyle factors. But just to summarize here, overreaching can be intentional or unintentional, and it can absolutely be used as a tool to increase your performance over the long term. Now, if we're looking at overtraining, again, as we mentioned earlier, we're looking at a much longer time scale here. So the symptoms that you're going to be seeing are much more persistent. A couple of days of taking it easy isn't necessarily going to improve and help get you back to baseline. It's going to take much longer than that. And just to give you a few ideas of what some of the symptoms here might be, if you're getting bad sleep, constantly getting sick or dealing with little injuries or big injuries, you're always very tired, you have a low mood. If you're constantly craving food, that can be another one. And then, of course, if you're seeing a dip in your performance in the gym or in competition, race, whatever it is, all pretty big signs if these are consistent over a period of months. And unlike overreaching, this is absolutely not something that is intentional. Overtraining is not a spot where we want to be. And one of the key reasons for this is that it just takes so much longer to recover from and get back to baseline. So, the end result of that can be that it interferes with any races or competitions that you have coming up, which again is absolutely ideal situation. So I want to take a quick look at what are some of the ways you can prevent overtraining and make sure that you don't get to that point. So number one, you want to be constantly monitoring your recovery, not to the point where you're obsessed about it, but it's absolutely something you should be aware of. So there's lots of different ways to go about this. But a few of my personal favorites are your resting heart rate. That's probably one of the most key ones for me. And not necessarily on a single day basis, but looking for trends over time here, maybe on a scale of like a week to week kind of thing. It's going to give you some pretty useful information. HRV, heart rate variability, your sleep, both quality and duration, as well as your perception. If you're finding it very hard to fall asleep, that could definitely be a sign of overtraining. And finally, your perceived recovery. So if you're constantly feeling sore or like you're just not ready to go for your workouts, that can be a good sign again that you need to dial things back slightly. And as I said, whenever you see any of these signs, you're looking for a trend week to week, be aware, and that's when you want to make some kind of adjustment, which we'll get to that in just a second, what that adjustment can look like. Other things to be monitoring would be, more on the performance side. So you can be looking at, your strength, if that's going down, whether it's you're not able to lift the same weights or you're not able to do the same number of reps at the same weight, that's a sign. As far as more on the endurance side, if you're running at the same pace, be it a zone 2 or a quality run, or whatever your endurance modality is, if you're at the same pace but you have a higher heart rate, again, over a consistent period of time, that's a pretty good sign that you're starting to get to that point where you're pushing too far. And finally, if you're running at the same pace and your RPE, rate of perceived exertion, is going up, in other words, the same pace is starting to feel harder, these are all signs that you want to be looking out for. Now, what to do when you do get to that point where you're seeing, generally multiple of these signs, it's probably time to consider taking a deload week. So there's a lot of different ways that could work, and it doesn't have to be exactly a week. It could be longer, it could be shorter. But as a pretty rough rule, I like to use a 70% reduction. So I've talked about this in other videos, but roughly, mileage is reduced by 70%, and then in the gym, number of sets is reduced by 70%. Depending on what the lift is in the gym, I will also sometimes reduce the weight by about 70%. But again, that kind of depends on the lift. If you're talking like a bicep curl, I'm probably leaving the weight the same. If you're talking about a deadlift, I'm probably reducing, maybe not fully to 70%, but at least a little bit of the weight to help take some of the load off. And then as you're going through this deload week or period, you want to be monitoring as many of these signs as you can. You might not be able to monitor all the performance ones quite the same if you're not going as hard and trying to push the limits in the gym, but you can absolutely be monitoring most of the recovery ones, resting heart rate, HRV, sleep duration, quality, and just overall how you feel. So as a hybrid athlete, when you're training with high volume, as many hybrid athletes do, you absolutely want to be very mindful of both overtraining and overreaching. If you're going to be overreaching, make sure that it's something that's happening intentionally, and make sure you're monitoring signs so that you're ready and recovering long before you get to the point of overtraining. If you're looking for a program to help with your training, I would strongly recommend checking out my app, Hybrid Strength Fitness. It is linked in the description, and it will automatically program in deload weeks for you, which will allow you to push yourself without overtraining. And just as a bit of a sneak peek of some future features that'll be coming is there's going to be a lot more functionality added to interact with you as the user to um, to understand what all your recovery metrics are, how you're feeling, and then the app will adjust your training accordingly. And again, that's not available yet, but it's work in progress and will be an upcoming feature soon.